Okay, so all right, so we are live now. Hello, good morning, everybody who is watching this from whatever time zone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Today we have Dr. Katerina Berezina with us. Dr. Katerina, thank you, Katerina, for accepting the invitation for being with me today on this channel. Um, So Dr. Katerina Berezina is an assistant professor right now in the Department of Nutrition and Hospitality Management at the University of Mississippi, which is also called uh, what is it called, Katerina?
All
Ole?
miss, all miss.
Okay, Ole Miss. And then Dr. Katerina received her PhD in Health and Human Performance with concentration in tourism at the University of Florida. I know her since 2015, actually, because we attended a conference together on a cruise ship. And then, I was lucky enough to work with her for a couple of years at University of South Florida before she left us and joined the University of Mississippi. So Dr. Katerina is originally from Russia, and there's where she got her undergraduate degree in hospitality and tourism. And then she came to US for her master's from University of Delaware. Right now, she is working on multiple things. One thing that is very special about Dr. Katrina, she's very, very organized. So
Thank you, Faisal.
that is something that I always admire. Her research areas are information technology and hospitality and tourism and revenue management. She's currently also managing editor for Journal of Hospitality and Tourism Technology. And she is also coordinator for two university programs that integrate real life hotel softwares and university hospitality related curriculum. So those of you who want to integrate some softwares into your curriculum, and if you want to use real world softwares while teaching hospitality, you can obviously reach out to Dr. Katrina. One of them is called Inroad University Program, and the other one is MP-Link University Program. Both of them are very interesting. I used Inroad software into my classes. I think it's very valuable for students. So that's a very brief introduction for Dr. Katrina. The reason why I invited you, Katrina, today is for two reasons. One is obviously because of your experience as a researcher, as an editor, and a reviewer. You're involved with GHTT for such a long time, and you are an integral part of it. But then the other thing why I invited you today was because I've seen you working with many graduate students over the years, right? You have served on committees for graduate students. You have also served as committee chair for many graduate students. And now at the University of Mississippi, you are also serving on doctoral students committees, and you are supervising and advising them. Many people on my YouTube channel are graduate students, and they are interested in listening to people like you, and they are interested to get answers from people who are experienced in advising and supervising students. So I know that most of the graduate students, as far as I know, right, the master students who have worked with you, most of them were successfully published after their master's thesis. So they published their master's thesis as a research paper in very well-reputed journals. So this is the background for why I invited you today, and you were very, gracious to accept my invitation. We have
Thank you
people
so
on,
much, Faisal. I'm
of
very
course.
excited to be here and thank you for your invitation.
It's my pleasure. Okay, so we have people on YouTube. If you have any questions, please make sure that you are adding them into the live chat, and then I'll ask those questions. Now, what I'll do is I will start with questions that I received over the last 1 week from people who saw my post on Facebook. So we can dive directly into some questions. But before we do that, Katrina, how about you take a couple of minutes and tell us some of the research projects you are working on, or a couple of exciting things that you are working on with your students at this time?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So, as you mentioned, my area of expertise in research and also teaching is hospitality information technology. So usually my research focuses on those areas that involve innovation and technology in the hospitality industry. I'm also interested in electronic distribution and those aspects of revenue management that are impacted by distribution and technology. So among the recent projects, I would say that several of them involved such technology as facial recognition. So
Mhm.
that falls into the domain of biometrics, and we worked on a couple of papers with my graduate students and other faculty members to investigate the adoption of facial recognition in different segments of the hospitality industry. Another project that is of interest to me, and the topic that is of interest to me right now, is virtual reality or VR. And I think that it offers also wonderful and amazing opportunities for the hospitality industry, for the professionals, and for the guests as well. So that's another area. And the third one is robotics and automation. So I have co-authored several research pieces, including the articles and also textbook chapters to investigate the role of robotics and automation in the hospitality industry.
All right, perfect. So pretty much related to technology, which is
Yes. Mhm.
very cool. So I talked at a couple of universities in the past week, and it's surprising at how many people are now thinking to work with technology, especially in response to this COVID-19 that we just talked before this stream. That this COVID-19 and the way people are working is such a big push to automation and technology. So more and more people are thinking about it. So very interesting.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
Okay, so let's go into the questions. I am going to go and start with some generic questions, and then we can go into specific questions.
Sure.
Now, one question that we get a lot, and you obviously know this as a graduate student mentor or advisor, you would also hear this question a lot from students. And this question is, how would I know the research I'm working on is worth?
Mhm.
So,
Excellent. Yes,
yeah.
that's a great question and very important. So, um, I think that to understand whether or not the research is worth, it needs to address um, different areas that are lacking knowledge, and that may apply to either academic knowledge or the industry and practice. So, and of course, I work in the field of the hospitality industry, which is very applied, right? And I'm sure that our audience comes from different disciplines, so the answer may slightly differ for different academic disciplines. But at the same time, I think that one of the aspects of research, the most important aspect, is to generate new knowledge. So then how we are generating that new knowledge may be considered from different angles. So the first one, for example, is the academic literature. So, for example, by reviewing academic papers, reading for graduate students for their classes, for faculty members, just reading published research that is out there, we identify those areas that are lacking some knowledge. So maybe they are producing contradictory findings. Maybe that particular area just doesn't have sufficient research to explain a certain phenomenon. So all of that creates a gap or a void in research that we may generate and close that gap or void, and then that would be a contribution, and that would make the research worth. So at the same time, I think that when we are creating the research and we are working on a project, we also need to think about how that project will be applied in real life. So if you are developing a particular research piece, then I would always think about how we are going to use the results of these findings. So you can ask yourself, so if we don't know this information, if we don't know the answer to these questions, then so what? And then if we do, what is going to change? So I think that if we keep thinking about these different aspects of research, covering both academic literature and academic impacts, plus the professional or the industry aspect, the applied aspect, that would, help students or, any other researcher to understand and justify why their research is worth.
All right. Thank you. Very interesting insight. Okay, Katrina, something related to this, just another question which came from a first year PhD student. I'm going to
Okay.
link it on the screen as well. And the question is, as a first year PhD student, um, is it important to focus on reading or writing? Which one is more important? What do you think about that?
Honestly, for me, it's very hard to separate those two processes. So, well, for a first year PhD student, I would say that you definitely should start with reading. But so you need to build the knowledge base and you need to understand what is happening in that area of research that you are targeting and where you want to go into. So you need to understand those gaps and voids in the literature. But at the same time, I think that it's very important to write regularly. So if you don't put your ideas on the paper, then I think that first of all, you can honestly forget about them. And how you start writing, you may develop that system by yourself. If you just, if you keep the annotated bibliographies, or if you just keep a journal where you write your research ideas, that would be something. And then, for example, when I was a PhD student, my PhD advisor shared with me a research skeleton, which was basically a one-page summary of a research project that I would want to do. So such research skeleton would include the topic of the project, then research problem, research questions, maybe suggested methodology. Um, so that is something that would allow you to capture your idea quickly. So, for example, if you are reading as a PhD student and you start getting those ideas, maybe put together this quick one page or one paragraph. And when you have several of them, go to your professor, go to your mentor, your advisor, and ask them, what do you think about these ideas? Because I think that it's very common for us to generate a lot of ideas, but then several of them will be rejected, right? But I think that writing is also a skill that requires practice. So basically, if you just read in the first year of your PhD studies and then you don't write anything, then that may create a certain barrier that you're not developing your habit of writing and you're not developing the routine. So I would say that in the first years, it's definitely very important to read, but at the same time, you need to start trying yourself in writing so that you can improve yourself.
Right. So it's a very good point that you bring, and I'll pick up two things here which are important to reiterate. One is talking to your advisor or talking to your
Mhm.
supervisor, which is just so important because your supervisor is a part of your journey, especially if you're a PhD student. It's like 3, 4 years of work where your supervisor is there to support you, not only academically but also emotionally too, because it sometimes can be a tiring process. So the more you talk to your supervisor, the better it is. I've seen many people who talk to everybody but their supervisor. uh,
Right.
so there are Facebook groups, there are social media groups, support groups, so people go, they vent out, they say everything, but when you talk to them and you ask them, have you talked to your supervisor, they say no. So people are just scared sometimes because maybe supervisors are full professors or they're busy or whatever. I think it's
Mhm.
very important that you talk to your supervisors because at the end of the day they are human beings, they understand what you are going through. So
Right.
this is one. And then the other thing that you said was it's important that you start writing. Yes, reading is very important. It's important that you start writing. Here's another thing that I've observed over the years, that there are a large number of people who are either perfectionists or either they strive to be perfectionists, and they want to be very good at writing before they start writing.
Mhm.
Right? There's a lot of plans, but there's nothing on the paper. So I think that it's completely fine if you make mistakes as far as you start doing them. So start doing things, make a progress instead of waiting for being perfect to do something. That's very important again because I've also seen cases where people have waited a year or 2 years before they start writing.
Mm-hmm.
And when they start writing, it's either too late or either the stuff that they know is outdated. So,
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's important to make some progress before you think about perfection or something like that. So,
Yes.
another interesting point. Okay, so there are a couple of questions. Here, I'm going to put one question. This is from Lubna. And the question says that if the research is not new according to the world, which I suppose is, theory, but necessary for my country as a developing country, what should I do?
Well, I think that definitely if the research is needed for a specific country, for a specific industry, then it needs to happen, right? So, what we need to consider in these cases is that, well, we already have, well, based on the question, I understand that research in that specific area already exists, right?
Mhm.
So, first of all, we need to examine that research that is already there, that body of literature that helps us with understanding that topic. So, if the author believes that there is still a gap that in application to my specific country doesn't allow me to use that knowledge to answer all those questions, then that's a gap. That's still a gap in the literature, and it's also a practical gap. So we often see studies that, for example, replicate a previous research in a specific context. What I think is important and needs to happen in a study like this is that you still need to go through that literature. You still need to look at it, synthesize it, and explain the key findings. But you also need to make a case for why it's not applicable or it's not enough to answer such questions in your country, right? So again, where this justification will come from. Maybe there is something specific about the industry where you are working and that you are researching. Maybe there is something specific to the economic system of the country, political system of the country, cultural values in the country. So, whatever you believe is making the difference that doesn't allow you to fully apply the previous findings of research, that will be your justification. So, also, what I would think is that, well, if the research is not new, but we need to repeat it for the new context for this developing country, is probably because we need to add some more variables. We need to generate that new knowledge, right? So then whatever justification that you provided from cultural values, from educational background of people, maybe it's an educational system, maybe political system, economic differences, anything else. So then I would think that all of these factors that you use to justify why this research is needed need to also be translated into the research design of your study, and actually not just repeat what has been done before but in your country, but also to add something new and try to fix those deficiencies that you think are in the literature from the previous context, so that you actually help your country and you develop the research that can answer these questions. So I think if this particular question is approached from this perspective, then you will be explaining and bringing attention to a situation that exists in the world, but nobody just noticed that, right? So you will make a contribution to the literature by doing that. Plus, you will also help your country and that specific industry in your country that needs these answers from your research. So I think it's perfectly fine if it's built correctly and it generates new knowledge for the literature, for the country, and for the industry where you're working.
Right. Thank you again, Katrina. Here, I would add a couple of things. From paper writing perspective. So obviously, when you do a research, if it's a thesis or a paper, it's different. But again, there are some similarities. What I've observed while reviewing papers is that one, there's no storytelling, right? So, and there's no
Mhm.
connection to different parts of your work, which is introduction, literature, then methods, findings, and then conclusion. Uh, what happens is in many cases, if there's something very important about your country, which you want to investigate, but there's existing research, what people do is they replicate the existing studies without really providing any information about the context, like what is so special about your country.
Mhm.
So yes, if you say my country is a developing country, it's not enough because in the world right now, there are so many developing countries, yet they are so
Mhm.
different from each other. Like, which you bring a good point, right? Cultural values, maybe the demographics, maybe the diaspora in the country. Like, for example, in Pakistan right now, there's 65% people between the age of 18 to 35, which is a very different scenario compared to, let's say, another developing country where there are many more baby boomers, right? So that type of thing should be highlighted in your introduction, where what is so special about your about your country. But then you should also bring it into your conclusion. In your conclusion, maybe one idea is to compare your country with a couple of other developing countries, because I want to highlight here Professor Dimitrios Mihalis. He normally says something, my mother's village syndrome, which he says that normally when you talk to your mother or grandmother, she always talks about her village, and she's so excited about talking, that my village was like this, like that. But how many people care about it? So you need to make your study very attractive by doing these comparisons with similar countries to see what is so special about your country and how your results are contributing for not only your country but other developing countries as well. So very good point again there. Okay, now because yeah, Katrina, you mentioned synthesizing the literature as well in your answer. So I have another question, and this question says that what is the difference between synthesizing the literature and critically reviewing the literature?
Okay, perfect question. So I think that these two things have to go hand in hand. So the way how I would explain it is that when you're synthesizing the literature, you need to find common areas. So, for example, instead of presenting your literature review as um, study one found this, this, and this, study two found this, this, and this, the synthesis would require you to say that study one and two found item number one, however, they disagreed about item number two, right? So that would allow you to present a summary, not presenting study by study in your literature review, but instead create a body of literature, a summary of what has happened. And the way how I usually recommend to do this to my students is not to go from one study to another in describing the results, but going from concept to concept. So, for example, I will use some concepts that are common for the hospitality research and maybe other business disciplines. So I hope that it will be useful for all other scholars out there. So let's say if we think about the concept of satisfaction, and that is commonly used in the hospitality research, then the student would need to look at the literature. Okay, what do we know about satisfaction? What are the common aspects about all these different studies that have been conducted? What are the common results? And what are the areas that are, for example, conflicting with each other? So, but then you also need to be critical about doing that from the perspective that you not only report what has found in the literature, but you also add your interpretation to that. So you need to critically think about what you're seeing. And then, for example, you can say that, well, you read these different studies and you say that, okay, this area has been widely explored. We know this, this, and this. However, nobody has paid attention to, let's say, and then you present your idea. So if you find a certain lack in the area, you find a gap, then that's what would bring the critical assessment, in my perspective, to the process of reviewing the literature.
Thank you. All right. So a similar question that comes from Sheikha Kiyumi. I hope I say it correct. I'm not butchering the name. Oh, but the question is, if I'm working on a new area, how can I write the literature review? So I suppose if it's a new concept that you are trying to
Mhm.
work on, how would you write the literature?
Well, that's a great question. And I actually was in a situation like this when I was writing my dissertation. My dissertation was on flash sales in the hospitality industry. So And flash sales are websites that allow time-limited discounts for products and services such as Groupon, Living Social, and other examples like this. But what I can share from my experience is that, well, first of all, I even had a challenge to find out what is this I'm researching. So I noticed that there are these websites such as Groupon, right? But I didn't even know what the common term for them would be. So, and that was the first process, that you actually need to understand what is that you're trying to conceptually describe, right? So, for example, you can go in different routes, such as, let's say we called industry partners, we read professional literature, the magazines about the hospitality industry that were writing about Groupon, and we try to see, okay, what are the key features that they are describing, how they present this concept, what does it mean, how it works, so then we found that, okay, that's a concept of flash sales, and different researchers have been calling it with different terms, because there was a certain evolution to the process, and that started as social commerce, for example. And then by discovering this, I found specific areas where I needed to look. So that would also give you certain knowledge. For example, as you look at the evolution of the concept, you can also see, does the previous findings still apply to this phenomenon in the way how it exists in the world currently? So then you also start thinking broader from that. So where does it fall conceptually, and what this concept represents? For example, following my story with hotel flash sales, the website provide deep discounts, right? So the area was absolutely new. I was dealing with just one academic paper that was published at that time. But if you think about the nature of the phenomenon, discounted sales are not new at all, right? So when you start going further and further and further from that initial idea that you started with, you will probably find the literature that would help you to support the development of your research. So then, as I started growing further away and thinking about that body of knowledge that already exists, I went into the pricing literature, I went into the consumer behavior associated with pricing to understand why would travelers purchase, for example, hotels through Groupon or websites like this. So then that will be, again, your job as a researcher to synthesize and critically look at that literature, right? And think, do the previous findings still offer any insights into the phenomenon that I'm trying to study right now? So, and then what I would do is that I would take those aspects that are already out there and definitely include them in my study and try to build from that. So if the concept is really different and the phenomenon is different from what has been studied before, then you may find some foundation in the literature, but you will not find the exact answers to the questions, right? So then that would allow you to build some literature review, some foundation for your research, plus you will need to take it further to actually study that specific phenomenon and that context that you want to study, and offer new insights and also the answers for the academic literature and for the world.
Right. So this actually, you bring a good point. I got into the same problem a couple of months ago. I was working with my graduate student Ramla on her research, which is related to service sweethearting. Now, service sweethearting means for your personal gains when you give away free stuff to your friends and family in order to get some sort of financial benefit from it, right? Something like that. Very interesting thing is that there's only one paper about service sweethearting, just one, like literally nothing else, right? So obviously she was into a trouble, like what should I write about it? Because the one paper that is about service sweethearting is a conceptual paper. It doesn't have any literature review, like nothing much. So what do I write in my thesis when I'm writing about service sweethearting? So similar issues, right? So then the idea was the same. So go back and see what is service sweethearting. It's an unethical behavior. So how about you read some literature related to unethical behavior? Why do people engage in unethical behavior? which actually requires you to not only focus on the topic of what under consideration, but related topics, but also into some other disciplines, because in hospitality maybe we don't have a lot of literature about unethical behavior, but maybe in psychology you have a lot of literature related to unethical behavior. So going into some other disciplines, finding related theories to the concept that you are studying would also be something that can help while you are working on something where it's a new area and whatever. It's a good segue into the next question.
Mhm.
And the next question is, what is theory and how important is it for research?
Excellent. Yes, that's a great question. I think that many PhD students are thinking about, um, and even beyond. So, well, if you look at the available publications, then you will probably find so many different sources that would talk about what is theory and what theory is not. So, but I think that if I were to try and give a very brief and condensed answer, then theory is a systematic view of the world or a general belief about how the world works. So then why is this important is because it helps us to explain certain behaviors or certain phenomena, certain linkages that exist in the world. So just like I gave you an example a couple of minutes ago about my research with flash sales, I was not able to find any literature until I thought about a broader concept, what flash sales represent. So flash sales represent discounted sales of products and services, right? So then when we look at the literature of discounting, then we already have some knowledge about how this works, how people behave, how companies behave, right? So basically, I would say that theory allows us to build generalizations about relationships, about how things, different phenomena work in the world. So why is this important in research is, well, because it's important so that you can actually build your study so that it contributes to the knowledge that is not there yet. So, for example, if many people have already described how what personality traits um, stimulate people to respond to discounting, then you can use that as a basis. And maybe there is no other need to look at, you know, how people will react to a specific type of a discount, right? If you can justify why there are differences, then definitely yes, that will be a contribution. But at the same time, that allows us to not do the same thing over and over again. Plus, it allows you to have a system or a structure for developing your own study. So, for example, it allows you to select the appropriate variables. It allows you to identify the scope of the study, right? It helps you to form that. You look at the variables that are relevant, suggested by the theory. You look at the relationships that the theory suggests. So I think that the theory sort of serves as a backbone for the study. And then, by taking that into a specific context, you add more muscle to it, right? And you basically build that body, you keep developing it. So those, I think, the main reasons why theory is very important, because it allows us to see the world, it allows us to see the system and how relationships are formed in the world. And it also allows us to build the studies and relate different studies to each other, make those connections within the literature.
Right, thank you, Katrina. I actually am following a flow of questions, but there's an interesting question that just came, and it's related to
Mhm.
the previous one, like the one that we just discussed about no literature and whatever. So, very interesting. It says if sufficient literature is not available, and I'm not able to place my topic in the broader domain, is it okay to pick and cite information from media knowledge or gray literature?
Well, yes, that's a great question. So I think that it's uh, it's okay to select some information from media. So as I mentioned in my previous answer, I had to use professional magazines to understand what was important for the hospitality industry when it came to flash sales, right? And that is basically something that helps you to justify the research problem, that it actually exists. So in the real world, there are some problems that, let's say, the hospitality industry or any other industry is tackling. So at the same time, I would be concerned about uh, using media coverage, for example, as any sort of a framework for your study. So if you are actually working in the area that lacks any theory, or you cannot find any theory from relevant disciplines that would explain that particular phenomenon, so then maybe there is a need for a theory. And let's say what I did with my dissertation is that I started with the grounded theory research that actually helped me to generate a framework. So, when you are working with a particular area and you are trying to address those questions that you think need attention, then the second step for you as a researcher is also to understand what's the best way to do that. So we have a variety of different methods, research methods that are available to us. So we may not be always able to base our research on existing theory. So then there is also place for generating your theory. So, and in my case, that was the solution and that was the route that I chose to go with. And then the first piece of my dissertation was qualitative. And then later, that also provided foundations for further quantitative studies because of the findings that I um, discovered during my qualitative process. So that's what I would say for this question.
All right, thank you. Now, because I'm focusing on the questions in the comments, I also want to acknowledge everybody who is thanking you and who is saying thank you for sharing your knowledge and
Yes,
love.
thank you so much.
So, yes, thank you all of you for being here and being part of this stream. Okay, so another very interesting question that came from Alfred. Is it always the case that every research should have a theoretical framework? If yes, how do you identify one for a study?
I would say that when you are engaged in academic research, yes, you should have a theoretical framework. So, my suggestion would be to follow that logic that I described with my dissertation, is that you need to think about the core idea of your research. So, what is that you're trying to study? So, and then try to arrive to some conceptualization of that particular phenomenon. So what is that in essence, right? So for example, I offered you the case of my dissertation where it was a specific case of discounting that was offering very deep discounts and it was very time limited. So, but then there are also other interesting research ideas. For example, there is a restaurant that intentionally offers a very bad service, right? So when you start thinking about what is this and why people go there, right? So you still need to think what is the essence of this phenomenon, right? So, and then if you start thinking broader and broader and broader, then maybe you will come to the literature. Oh, wait, why people watch horror movies, right? So if we follow the logic that we only go after hedonic consumption, then we will be leaving out many different areas of people behavior, right? So, but then if you start going further away from that core concept that you're trying to consider, you will be able to find other different studies that may help you to find that theoretical framework, right? And when you just look at that at the first glance, it may seem like there is nothing in common between a restaurant with intentionally bad service and horror movies, right? I would not have an idea to search for horror movie article when I was doing my research. But trying to find examples like this and generalize what other situations when people would behave in a similar way, I think that would help. So, but maybe you work in the different disciplines, but trying to follow the same thought process and finding similarities of what exists in the world and how we describe those phenomena. So then when you read different articles about the topic of your research, or maybe some topics that are relevant that describe similar behavior or similar relationship in the world, then you may find other authors relying on certain theoretical frameworks, right? So then I would suggest going to that initial source. Usually the theoretical frameworks are cited within the literature or the theoretical framework in the paper. So you can go to the initial articles and then follow that theory. Investigate what does it explain, what are the common contexts or the situations that it helps us to understand and describe. So, and go like this. So from my experience, usually working with literature, in a way works like a snowball. So you discover something else and then you go further and further and further. And at some point you may find yourself that, you're stuck with a certain ball, even though it may grow to a large size, but then you may have to start another one. So, and then you develop that line of research as well, and you investigate the new theory, and then you make a decision which one works best for your case, or maybe it needs to be a certain modification of a theory, or sometimes a combination of theories. So that's what I could recommend for finding a theoretical framework.
All right, perfect. So a very good answer, and which actually relates to the next question again. And this question came just in, saying that can we develop a framework by using more than one theory?
Yes, I think that you definitely can. And what I would say is that um, one aspect that you need to be careful about is the level that the theory works at, or the level that the theory explains. So, for example, if you're studying individuals and you're using psychology theories, like different theories that explain behavior of an individual, then yes, and you have a certain logic and explanation for why in your context, in your specific research, you need to combine these theories, then that's probably a good approach. But at the same time, if you're looking at, let's say, a theory that applies to an individual and a theory that applies to, let's say, a country, then, that may create a problem. But if you are working at the appropriate level, then I think you can combine theories. And I see that done in research very often, so that when we are going into a new area, especially when in many of your examples, I hear this theme that you're not finding enough literature. And then Faizan and I have already suggested going to relevant disciplines or close disciplines, or maybe overarching disciplines, then you can find theories that may help to partially explain behavior in that specific context that you are researching. But you may also try to bring new information by combining several theories together.
Okay. Now there's another question, and actually there are two questions, so I'm going to put them together because I don't know this question, what was the intention behind it. So, but I assume it might be from somebody who's a qualitative researcher, saying that can we work on a study with no theory, or there's another one that is here. Hold on, let me go. Yes. How do we develop a framework if my research method is qualitative and need to develop a framework? So basically, I think that the question is if we don't have a set theory, how do
Mhm.
we work with that?
Yes, definitely. Well, there are studies that can be done without a theoretical framework, and probably the qualitative context will be a great example. So, speaking very broadly, uh, in many cases, we do qualitative research when we want to have a deep understanding of the phenomenon, and when we don't have sufficient theoretical frameworks to rely on to build quantitative studies. So
Mhm.
in that case, well, there are definitely qualitative studies that are also driven by theory. But if the question is that can my study have no theory? Yes, that can, especially when you are trying to develop a theory, for example. So I spoke earlier about my dissertation where I was in the same situation of lack of the literature and working in the new area. So I chose to develop the framework by myself. So I used the grounded theory approach and I conducted interviews on the topic of my research and then developed the framework based on that. So yes, it's definitely possible to start without a theory, but usually what I would say, even when you are in a qualitative domain and you are starting out without this theory, sort of with a blank page, then usually on the back end, and we usually see that in qualitative research, that it's described by very thick and rich descriptions of all of the findings so that you actually present the story and you present a deep understanding. But sometimes in qualitative studies, you need to find theories on the back end to explain the findings that you observed in your research. So then, if you think about like sort of a traditional outline for a quantitative paper where you start with an introduction and then you go into the literature presenting your conceptual or theoretical framework and then progressing to methods and so on, in qualitative research you may find yourself in a situation presenting theoretical frameworks at the end because you are trying to find something that would explain the results that you received and also try to fit the study and the results of the study into the context of larger literature so that you can build the connections and you can explain what you are seeing, and also you can explain how the results of your study are relevant to the research that already exists.
All right, thank you, Katerina. So now let me ask you this question. So, and let me put it on the screen as well. So
Sure.
sometimes reviewers ask for theoretical support, right? So what does it mean? Does it mean we need to add a theory to support it, or any literature, like in hypothesis
Mm-hmm.
development for each
Mm-hmm.
relationship, we add some literature support, right?
Right.
Is it the same, or are these different things?
Right. So let's say when I ask for theoretical support, then I would usually mean the theory behind the relationships. So, but at the same time, when you are building a study, uh, depending on the context of the review, it may probably mean both. So let's say if you found a theory, but we have talked about different situations where you modify a theory, right? Or you bring another theory. So or you're trying to conceptualize your study and you're trying to explain why these two theories would work together. So in some cases, it may mean bringing in literature that would explain that in a certain context, certain aspects of that theory would or may work differently. So normally, I would think that yes, they are asking for a theoretical framework that already exists or a theory that exists, but sometimes it may be just support from the literature that justifies certain changes or certain way of thinking that you adopted for your study.
Perfect. So now let's move to a couple of other questions. There's one question that was, what is the difference between theoretical and conceptual framework?
Okay, yes, that's a great question. Again, well, if you look at the research methods, literature, and other areas adjacent to that, you'll find probably a lot of writing on this particular topic. So I will share my understanding of how I look at the theoretical and the conceptual framework. So if you look at these two words, one of them derives from theory and another one derives from concept, right? So the concept for me presents a certain worldview or the way how you approach a topic. And then a theory may present you with a more formal way of explaining certain relationships in the world. So let me give you an example to think about this. Recently, I was working on a paper that was about online food ordering. And That's probably everybody's familiar with the topic, right? Even if you don't research it, you use a laptop or mobile app and you order food online, right? So then if we start thinking about this conceptually, right, that will be my conceptual framework. What is this phenomenon? So what is the essence of it and what exactly I want to understand here? So in the hospitality and tourism research, there is very limited number of studies right now that have already looked at this topic. And if you look at them, they are all quite different. So for example, some studies, they chose to think that, well, you have to use some sort of technology, right? So you have to have a mobile app or you have to have a laptop, go to a website to order food online. So that would fall into domain of how people adopt technology or accept technology, right? So if I want to understand how people shape their behavior of ordering food online, then probably I need to look at the literature that would explain how people have adopted technology in the past, right? So then, if we keep thinking about this concept, then ordering food online, through that process, someone receives a service, right? And by using a combination of a service and technology, we can say that, well, it's a self-service process. So somebody is doing something for themselves. So I can say that this is a self-serving process, and therefore there must be attributes of service quality that are inherent in that process, and they may influence the way how someone decides whether or not they would place an online food order. So that's my conceptualization of the topic. You can either think about this from the perspective of technology adoption, or you may think about this from the perspective of service quality. And that would send you in completely different streams of literature, completely different bodies of literature. And that would also call for very different theoretical frameworks, right? So, for example, if I go into the road of technology adoption, then I would need to look at the theories that were guiding that particular area of research, such as technology acceptance model, and then unified theory of acceptance and use of technology, and then probably try to bring them into the context of my study and maybe modify them or work with those theories. And then if I go with the route of service quality, then I will need to look at the literature on service quality, understanding service quality, measuring service quality. There are studies on electronic service quality and even electronic self-serve, right? So you will see that I will be, and my research and thinking from that point on will be driven by completely different theoretical frameworks. So that's how I distinguish between those two. So at the conceptual level, you try to understand, okay, this is the phenomenon and this is how I am looking at it because it's important. And then you also bring in the theoretical framework that will actually help you to determine the relationships, the variables, and it will allow you to build the research further. So I know that these two concepts, they both sound very high level thinking, generalizable way of understanding the research question that you have in mind or the phenomenon that you're trying to research, but that's how I would explain the difference. The conceptual is just the overall way of thinking, the viewpoint, but the theoretical may be more formal theories that you can find in the literature that help you to develop and guide your research.
Okay. Thank you, Katerina. I think we did talk a lot about theory and theoretical frameworks and all this. So, because the time is limited, I want to move very quickly to a couple of questions that are related to findings.
Sure, of
Then
course.
a couple of questions about the last part of your paper or thesis. So one question that I saw, which was very interesting, actually it caught my attention, and that
Yes.
was this one. If all my hypotheses are not supported, right? So let's say 5, 6
Mhm.
hypotheses are supported, what do I do?
Okay, yes, that's a very interesting question. So in the very specific situation, I would say, I would be curious to see how that happened. So usually, I would expect that if your research was built on some theoretical base, some previous literature, then it's very unusual for me to hear that none of the hypotheses were supported. So it's difficult for me to comment on why all of them didn't work. But at the same time, I think that when your research hypothesis is not supported, it's not something wrong. So that's a new discovery. So if we follow the logic of how research is usually developed, we try to conceptualize the certain phenomenon that we are interested in, right? We try to find a foundation for building our research in previous studies. So basically, every time we need to do a very thorough job of reviewing all of the papers that were, or all relevant papers, of course, that existed before we started our research. So then, if all of a sudden you find that the relationship doesn't work, that's great. That's great. So I know that some, well, probably students, PhD students, when they start their research, they're worried that, oh, I proposed this hypothesis and then it doesn't work. Well, that means that you discovered something different. So if we would not discover something different, or if we wouldn't follow that line of research, we may still believe that the world is flat, right? So, but when you create something or you find something which is contradictory to previous findings, that's an opportunity for you to examine why this is so. And what I would think about this situation is that having a hypothesis that is not supported is not negative, or it's not bad for your thesis or dissertation or a research paper that you're writing, but it's an opportunity for you to think why this has happened, why all previous literature was showing different results, and why your paper is showing different results, right?
Right.
So that may come from different areas. So maybe something that we talked about, a specific country at the very beginning of this session, right? So maybe there is something different to that country. Maybe there is something different about the sample that you collected, right? So we all work with different samples. So sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's not, right? So you just need to look critically at your results and, be your worst critic and try to see what I have done right, what I have done wrong, what may explain these differences. So maybe there is something in design of your study that has led to this different result in hypothesis testing. Or maybe there is something interesting. Maybe you're onto something and you need to build another study and research that. So I don't think that having a unexpected result or not supported hypothesis in your study is a negative thing, but you need to carefully look at that, why that happened. Evaluate your reasoning, evaluate your theoretical framework, evaluate the context of your study, plus all the methods, such as your sampling, your statistical analysis, your data cleaning approach, and all of that.
Right. So again, I just want to reiterate what you said. It happens to a lot of people. Like, not. I mean, the question is if all my hypotheses are not supported, right? And you answered it perfectly. So I even say, like, even if one or two of your hypotheses are not supported, even then you have to think about why is it not
Yeah.
supported, or why is it not according to what I proposed, right? And most of the times, because all these numbers that we use to support our hypothesis come from your data, this is not magic, right? And
Mhm.
data is from your respondents. So if it's not supported, it may really mean that your respondents do not agree to what you are saying. Or you might have made some mistake in the methodology while you are designing the study or while you are collecting or cleaning the data. One thing that happens to a lot of people where because of not understanding the concept of heterogeneous groups within your sample, right? So, for instance, if you are collecting data about food ordering, right, online food ordering apps or something, now obviously you have male and female in your samples, and sometimes what happens is that male and female show very different or distinct behavior. and it's highly possible that both of them nullify, each other in the sample. So it's important that you understand these concepts, and if your hypotheses are not supported, go into some additional analysis to see maybe you can find some very interesting insights. One mistake that many people make is if your hypotheses are not supported, you don't include them in your discussion, which I think is not a good approach. So if your hypothesis is not supported, make it part of your discussion. Like what Katrina said, that's an unexpected result that may even be a good contribution, right? So be innovative, be a little bit courageous with your findings. If it's not supported, it's not that you are the culprit. It's just maybe something very interesting that you are afraid of discussing. So, all right, let's go into the second last question, which is this one, but I've got this question into different versions, right? So this one says why there's a need to write theoretical and practical implications twice at introduction and end of the article. So this is one, but I'm going to read a couple of other questions which are
Sure.
related, and then you can answer them all together, right? So this is a question from Lena. She says, can you talk please about writing theoretical contribution of the study? So that's number two. And number three, the similar question that I want to read is, do you have any tips to write chapter 5 or discussion and implication part of a paper, which exactly is the same all these three questions. So what would you say?
Excellent. Yes. So theoretical contribution and chapter 5, right? Okay,
Yeah.
excellent. So all of those very good and important questions. So I will start with the question number 1 because they are similar but not exactly. So not exactly the same. So the first question was asking why we need to write theoretical and practical implications twice. So I would like to maybe correct this question a little bit because you're not writing the implications twice. Yes, it's absolutely right that in the introduction, you need to think about theory and practice, and in the discussion or the closing of your paper, you need to think about theory and practice. But those are two different approaches. So what needs to happen in the introduction? In the introduction, you position your paper. You justify the research problem, you explain the research purpose and the significance of that paper. So basically, you need to concentrate on the problem that exists in the world or the problem that exists in the literature and highlight that. You need to show the research gap. Plus, together with that, you may want to show a very high level bird eye view, maybe one paragraph summary of how literature has approached this topic in the past. So that would help you to justify the need for your research and also highlight the significance of this research. So when you are in the discussion section and you are actually writing the theoretical and practical implications, you're writing of what the results of your study mean for the theory and practice. So if in the introduction you said that there was a gap in the literature, in the conclusion you will say that we closed the gap or we made one step forward to close that gap, right? So when you're writing your then I think that I will go into the area how to write the theoretical contribution. So when you're writing the final chapter of your paper or a dissertation, so then you would need to think about different aspects. And for example, at the beginning, Faizan mentioned that I'm a managing editor of the Journal of Hospitality and Tourism Technology, where for that last section of the papers, we usually recommend several components. One of them would be conclusions. The next one would be theoretical contribution. The next one is practical implications. And the fourth one is the limitations and future research. So, of course, you may find other approaches to writing that particular chapter. And if it's a dissertation, definitely speak to your advisor and what exactly they want to see in that section. But in general, I really like that approach of following these 4 sections that I just mentioned. So in conclusions, you need to summarize briefly the results of your study without using any statistics. All statistics stay in the findings section. So again, if we are speaking about the quantitative study. So then in conclusions, you just say that we conducted, for example, a quantitative study that used a survey or maybe used an experiment, and we studied this variables by applying this theory. So, and then you can say that we found that variable 1, 2, 3 works. However, variable 5 and 6 doesn't offer any contribution. So that's a big picture overview of what was reported in the finding sections. So then when you go into the theoretical contribution or theoretical implication section, you need to think about what the results of this particular study brought to the literature and to the development of the theory. So how you can approach thinking about this? There are, I think, different areas where you can look at. I think that the theoretical contribution would be in proposing an overall approach, how you looked at that study. Maybe you applied a new theory, maybe you modified the theory as we discussed before. Somebody was asking about combining theories, right? So maybe you did that. So then you describe what has happened and what's the contribution. So let's say if you're writing a qualitative study and you developed a theory, then of course there is a clear contribution to theory development, right? So, but if you're working with a quantitative study and maybe the study was trying to predict a certain phenomenon, such as I was giving you an example of using online food ordering process. So then you may look and compare your model with other models. So you can see how well your model is predicting that particular behavior as opposed to other models. You may look at the way how you conceptualized that particular process. And we also talked about the difference between conceptual framework and theoretical framework. So again, saying that, let's say all previous studies looked at the on the phenomenon of online food ordering from technology perspective, but we actually looked at the service perspective and service quality perspective. Then looking at your measurement. So by the way how you conceptualize the study, some of the variables could have been operationalized in different ways, meaning that they were measured in different ways compared to some of the studies in the same area. So then that would be another way to explain your theoretical contribution. And then, of course, looking at each, let's say, hypothesis or each relationship that you were investigating. So that is, I would say, would be the theoretical contribution part. The practical implication part would speak to that applied part of your research. So for my studies, it's usually the hospitality industry, right? So if we conducted the study in the context of the hospitality industry, then we usually may make recommendations for managers of maybe hotels, restaurants, events, depending on the segment of the industry that the study was built on. And then here you need to give specific recommendations, for example, saying that well, these are the circumstances when hotels may engage in flash sales promotions. Or here are the specific recommendations that online food ordering platforms may implement to improve the service quality of their customers. So that is something that could be actually implemented in practice to improve consumer experience or improve business practices, processes, improve business results, right? So, and then the last section that I suggested there was limitations and future research. And they may be sometimes even separated. Let's say when you're working on a dissertation, and it's, of course, a longer manuscript than a journal submission, then your advisor may ask you to separate those. What are your limitations and what are the directions for future research? But for example, for an academic article in the Journal of Hospitality and Tourism Technology, we suggest to put these two sections together because in a way they feed one into another, right? So when you think critically about everything that you have conducted, when you have conducted your study and about all the methods, the sample, the conceptualization, the theories, and so on. So that may also give you ideas for how you can further develop this stream of research and right there generate the ideas. So for example, if you are in a situation that you let's say you research specific market or specific culture. So it's very common for us to see in research that the results do not exactly transfer to other cultures, right? So that's why we have so many intercultural studies trying to compare and understand how people in different countries behave in certain circumstances. So um, items like this would actually help you to generate ideas for future research. So of course you need to be honest and open about what you have done in your study, and um, maybe there are some circumstances that you couldn't overcome and something is not ideal or there is a certain limitation. Every study has them, right? So but then you also need to take that as an opportunity to think what I can do next and how I can improve this research or how I can take it further. So maybe your results of the study gave you ideas. We talked about unexpected findings and not supported hypotheses, right? So that I think is something that's an idea for future research that doesn't come from any limitation of the study, but it actually comes from the findings of the study. So now you need to think more about why that happened, and can you replicate it in other situations? Can you replicate it with other samples? Can you find it in any other circumstances in the research environment? And so that may lead to theory modification or development of a new theory, for example. So yes, but in summary, that's what I would suggest: starting with a conclusion that wraps up your study, then giving theoretical contribution, practical implications, and then limitations and future research.
All right. Thank you, Katrina. Very detailed. Because time is over, I will ask one general question. Before, there's a couple of things. One is some people are joining the stream now, and some questions are things that we already discussed, like can we do a study without theory? How many
Right.
theories do we need? What is theory? That type of stuff. So I would recommend watching the video because it's on YouTube, so you can watch it later on because we discussed it. Another thing that I see many people are asking questions, not only in this live chat, but normally on Facebook also, about specific formulas of success,
Okay.
which is like how many variables do I need in my model, or how many hypotheses do I need in my model, or things like this, like how many interviews do I need to do, like with that specific number, right? Obviously, you are invited to answer this question, but I think that there is no formula, right? It depends on the need of the study. But let me see, what do you think, Katrina? Like when people ask these specific questions, like how much, how many, that type
Yes,
of thing.
well, I understand that everybody wants some certainty or a certain target, right? But I think that the questions about how many research questions, how many variables, how many theories cannot be answered just in a general discussion, or it cannot be even answered in a specific discussion because everything depends on the topic. It depends on the literature that is already available. It depends on the problem that you identify, and it depends on the gap or the void in the literature. So I, I think that some of the mistakes that I also hear from different researchers, students, or somebody else is that, oh, let's say I learned that there is PLS-SEM, right? So I don't know my research question, but I'm going to use PLS-SEM in my dissertation, right? So that's a little bit backward. So I think that before you select your topic of the dissertation, before you find that problem and the purpose and what you're actually trying to do, you cannot even say if you are using quantitative or qualitative research. So if you are reading the literature and you're already certain that, okay, I'm studying this area, I'm seeing some disconnects in the literature or conflicting findings, I'm sure that I'm following this research and there are questions that are arising, so then it's already something for you to get started, that okay, I'm working with this topic in quantitative domain, so I'm actually drawing the hypothesis and so on. So but I would also be very uh, against the idea, I would say, of giving someone a specific requirement that you need to have 2 research questions in your paper, or you need to have 5 research questions in your paper, because all of that is actually driven by that specific purpose and problem of the study. So you mentioned one aspect about how many interviews I need to conduct, or let's say how many surveys I need to collect, right? So those questions are a little bit easier to answer, right? Because if we look at the research methods literature, then there is usually guidance on how to follow a specific research method. But again, you need to be critical and you need to be thinking. You are a researcher, right? So that's basically our job. We need to think. So I will give you an example of the study that I have already mentioned on conducting a grounded theory approach on flash sales in the hotel industry. So when you look at the literature on qualitative research, you may find some guidance. It may be very vague, but you may find some guidance that, for example, you should conduct at least 12 interviews, right? But at the same time, you should not stop there. You need to keep thinking about the rigor of qualitative research in this case, and how you can actually unfold the research and answer the research question. So in my case, uh, I I ended up having many more interviews than 12. So because to explain the reason is um, the sampling that I was working with, it was the hotel industry. So for those of you who work in the hospitality, you know that the hotel industry is very diverse. There are independent hotels, there are branded hotels, such as those flagged with Marriott's, Hilton, Hyatt. And then within those all of these hotels, there are also different service levels, such as some hotels are economy, some hotels are luxury, right? Then there are also hotel management companies, there are hotel corporate offices. And all these players, they may think about a specific topic from very different perspectives. So even though I was following the grounded theory approach, I could not stop at that number that was suggested in the literature, even though that number existed, right? There was some suggestion. But if you want to look at the rigor and the quality and dependability of the research that you are developing, then I couldn't stop, right? So let's say for qualitative studies, there are certain guidelines that you need to follow, how you reach rigor, and let's say you look at data saturation in your interviews. When you're working with quantitative research, then you also need to think about the theoretical frameworks and measurement. And there are certain guidelines for how you need to approach your sample size. But again, it's different. So yes, I definitely agree with Faizan that I would be very reluctant to give any numeric answer to the question how many hypotheses or how many research questions you need when it comes to the sampling, for example, such as the number of interviews or number of surveys. Then I definitely think that you need to be knowledgeable about what the literature recommends, but at the same time, you need to keep thinking critically about what your specific research requires.
Right. Thank you, Katrina, for very detailed answer to this one. My last question still remains there.
Sure.
I would just say that there are so many more questions in the live chat as well as on my list that we didn't answer, and that's because of time. But I'm sure that we can have you and also many other speakers who can answer similar questions in the future. This is never-ending discussion, like all these
Yes,
questions remain
that's
there,
true.
right? So, all right. So my last question is, and this is very relevant to these days, the situation that we are in.
Yes.
So, the question was very long. I just made it short into tips about work-life balance. I know that many of us, like I have 2 kids and
Mhm.
home and family and work and COVID-19 and everything.
Mhm.
And I'm sure that you are going through similar stuff because, family and everything. What are some of the tips that you apply in your daily life to manage the work-life balance?
Thank you. Yes, that's a great question. Well, that may sound unusual to some people, but When I started, for example, my PhD program, then I had the feeling that I was working nonstop.
Mhm.
And you were always working. And in academia, I think it's a nice part of the job that, for example, if I have my computer with me, then I can work anywhere as long as the computer is there and the internet connection is there. But at the same time, the more the further you move forward in your life, and as you mentioned, you have more responsibilities at the job and you have, let's say, more family responsibilities, then you actually start thinking about how do I manage this. So something that I have been doing is that, well, of course, planning, right? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on planning and writing the to-do list and strategy, but that definitely needs to take place. So well, maybe I will talk about this because it's an important process as well. So, for example, sometimes, and I know that we have a lot of PhD students in the audience, we may find ourselves in a situation that you are under pressure that I need to publish, I need to finish, I need to do this, and this, right? But at the same time, you need to be careful about your time and protecting your leisure and your connections with family, friends, and so on. So sometimes you may find in a situation that you don't have enough projects to work on, or you don't have any papers yet. Then yes, you need to seek the guidance or collaboration with others and you need to start working. But sometimes you may find yourself in a situation that you kind of need to take a step back and slow down so that you can do a quality job on those projects that you are doing. Plus um, you don't burn yourself on the job, right? So if you, for example, graduated with your PhD and you're burned out and you need to start a new academic job, well, the secret is that it doesn't get easier. So I know that many students think that, oh my god, this PhD, it's finally done, right? So there is this joke for a reason, you're finally done, so now I'm going to go and live my life. Well, then academic job is even more demanding than your PhD years, right? So if you are starting as a new assistant professor and you're all burned down, then it's very difficult then, and you're maybe setting yourself for a failure. So, but also something that I started doing is that I'm tracking different projects in which stages they are. So you can choose your own system. You can keep an Excel spreadsheet. You may like sticky notes. You may like a whiteboard and just write everything on it. I use Trello with boards to keep track of different projects, and I have different piles. So, for example, something which is sort of in a conceptualization stage that I'm thinking about, something that is in the literature review, something in the data collection stage, writing up, submission, revision, maybe rejection, and then acceptance. So basically what it does, it helps me to see the pipeline. Also, when I see that something is rejected, then usually that paper needs to be moved to other areas, right? So, such as you are redoing the study completely, or you're just repositioning and rewriting it and submitting it to different journals or maybe a different funding agency. So, and if it's accepted, then it also helps me to keep that list running because you usually need to update your CVs on a regular basis. Faculty have different reporting responsibilities such as faculty activity report or something of that nature. So that helps me to keep a big picture view of what's going on and what needs attention. So in addition to that, I try to separate sort of time for work and time for life. So, but I cannot say that I'm perfect. I'm still working on it, and I still need to do some work, let's say at night when I come back from the office. But I have been trying this system before the COVID situation changed our world, that I would actually go to the office from 8 to 5 and work there, concentrate on my work, and then try to minimize anything work related when I come back home. So, and well, I'm still in the journey as well, but those are some of the recommendations that I would give. So, and well, I think that also you really, whether you're a PhD student or you're a faculty member already, I think that your mentors and your advisors play a very important role in the way how your research develops, how your career develops. So sometimes you have that question and you just, well, I'm puzzled. I don't know what I need to do in this situation. And then um, you reach out to a friend, a colleague, a mentor, and then you try to find some guidance in that situation and then make the decisions for yourself. So yes, I think that you definitely need to have time for both, because if you're always working, that may be great for your career, but you may just burn yourself. So, and you need some quality time with your family and friends. And I think that it actually helps you to recover. And then when you come back to work, you will actually be more productive and more concentrated. So think about that. If you're leaving today, let's say at 5 p.m. for a vacation, and you need to finish that paper or that lesson or that chapter in your dissertation, how motivated you will be, right? So if you would have that little deadline for you in your mind every day, that, yes, that's a miracle.
Right. So, you brought some good points. I mean, I do the same thing. Like, I said it in one of the previous streams. I don't know. I guess I was talking to Professor Stan that
Mhm,
using this, gift or what is it, incentives to your own self sometimes helps a lot. Like what you
mhm,
said, and it can be a simple thing. It can be like just going to the beach or go get an ice cream to eat, or maybe go for a
mhm,
1 or 2 days vacation or something like that at the end of 2 or 3 weeks, when you have done extensive amount of work. Another point that you brought was some sort of a system. Now, obviously, people are different, right? Like I'm very
mhm,
different compared to you. Or, I normally have a short attention span, so I cannot sit down and study for like 2 hours straight. I can't do that. Okay, after 40, 45 minutes, I'm done. So I have to take a break, go do something else. And that's how I have developed systems for myself that work for me. Obviously, you have developed systems that work for you. What's important is that you should have a system that you can use to track your performance, your progress, and all that. What that system can be, it can be different for different people. Like for me, the best motivation is to really, have something like this, um, and cutting it off. I'm really motivated to, like, I like the sound
cross
of
something off. Yeah.
crossing off the list. So I want it physically on my desk. That's what I do for pretty much everything.
Mhm,
Now, once you develop systems, I mean, you try very hard to finish what you have planned to do for that day. But if you cannot finish, you shouldn't be demotivated. Rather, you should be motivated to finish that and the other stuff the next day. So systems are important. They help a lot. Family is important, obviously, to have that balance that, like you said. But lastly, that one thing that you said that I really, really agree to is to build some good relationships, especially your advisors, your mentors, your supervisors. They are people who are your friends for your life. Yes, during your PhD, maybe the relationship is not like a friend, it's a very different power structure. But once you are graduated, then it's pretty much the same, right? So I want to give a shout out to a couple of people who have developed me into who I am.
mhm.
Obviously, it's Dr. Kashif and Dr. Muslim from Malaysia, but then a huge, huge difference in my life was made by Dr. Professor Jihan. I really want to, say thank you to him for what he has done to me and many other people that I know. In fact, recently
Yeah.
we were at a conference and the entire room I saw around, and pretty much everybody was touched by him at some sort of, in some
Yes,
sort of.
that's true. Yes, I second that. He's definitely a very important person in my life as well, and I know that he has touched lives of so many students, right? But for example, we have had these discussions today about the advisor. So, for example, for me in my PhD program, my advisor was my greatest supporter. So
Mhm.
I think that that's the way that it should be, and that's the way how you should strive to build your relationships. So if you are afraid to ask a question to your advisor, then well, maybe there are certain reasons for that, but you just need to find out, like, what is this? Like, you're just afraid that they're so critical, or you're afraid that you're a burden. But normally the advisor, you know, they make a decision to work with a PhD student, right? So they should allocate some resources, and they are usually also invested in the development of that PhD student, and they want to help them grow and so on. So maybe you just need to find the best way and the best system how to work with that advisor. So understand, do they prefer an email? Do they prefer an in-person meeting? Do they prefer a meeting every week, or do they prefer a meeting every month? Do they want to talk about every idea that you have, or do they want you to bring 3 ideas and you choose? So I think that every person has their own style, but then you just need to figure out how to work with them. But from that perspective, let's say Dr. Jihan was my master's thesis advisor, and my PhD advisor, Dr. Kelly Samrat. So they were the people who invested in me.
Yes, and like I said, they're lifelong, right? So even now, like if it's not even about my work, my personal issues, I can easily pick up my phone, call Dr. Jehan,
Mhm.
and he talks to me. If needed,
Yes.
he will take me a Dunkin' Donut or something just to talk me out of things. So I think those relations are very important. Anyway, we are past the 1 hour mark. We are actually past 1.5 hour mark.
Yeah. Well, we
Uh,
had a great discussion. Yeah.
Yes, and like I said, this discussion never ends. This is very interesting, and I like doing it. And I'm very fortunate to
Mhm.
have people like you, other people who are willing to also contribute to this. Because many people on my YouTube channel are from developing countries, and they do not have access to resources like this. So I'm very sure that people have learned a lot from your experiences and what you just said today for like last 1.5 hours. Well, I hope that we will invite you sometime soon again, and
Thank
we can
you. Absolutely.
for the rest of the questions. Thank you very much,
Yes.
Katrina.
Yes.
Best of luck for your job, for your research, and I hope that everybody stays safe and we will go through this COVID-19 together.
Thank you for having me, Faizan, and thank you to everyone who was on the live session today and for your participation and great questions. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
and best of luck with everything that you do.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.